In my latest podcast, I talked about Joanne filing bankruptcy and how if they can't find a buyer to carry on that legacy, they might very well go out of business. Yes, that means that all that big twist yarn that we've come to love, it might not be no more. As a crochet designer, having your favorite yarn discontinued causes so many issues, doesn't it? Is it stressing you guys out as much as it is me? We're gonna have to find a new yarn to work with in our designs. What about our previous published patterns? Are we gonna have to go back and rework our patterns or change the yarn information in our patterns? Listen, don't freak out. I have a solution for all your discontinued yarn woes. One of my client friends, Samantha from Squibble's Crochet Corner, asked a great question in the comment section of my podcast. And y'all know I probably could have easily answered the question, but I'm all about the education here at Sweetbird Crochet. Let me read to you what she said. Thank you so much for an informative podcast. Hoping they don't go out of business. If Joann's were to go out of business or any yarn company and you use their yarn in one of your designs, should you put a note in the pattern that the yarn used in the pattern is no longer available and make recommendations for a different yarn? How would you best go about that? In today's video, I'm going to answer Samantha's question, and I'm going to share with you 4 different ways that you can write yarn information in your crochet pattern that is going to give your readers all the information they need, so if a yarn is ever discontinued, they won't have any issues. Okay, so I'm going to answer Samantha's question, and I'm going to show you 4 different ways you can write yarn information in your pattern that's going to help your readers substitute yarn if a yarn is ever discontinued or unavailable. Yarn is always changing and evolving. You might go into your local craft shop one day and you'll see that the shelves are just stocked full of your favorite yarns. And then, like if you go into Michael's, you might see it just full of, Bernat blanket yarn. And then the next week you go in and there's nothing. And that actually happened to me this week. I went into Michael's and I could not find, there were so many empty slots of yarn, the shelves were just bare. It was devastating. And then, of course, what is going to happen when when Joanne goes out of business? I'm thinking they probably will. But if they go out of business, we'll know in a couple of weeks because I think the hearing is on the 12th or something like that. Anyway, so if they do, we're going to see they're going to liquidate everything and we'll not be able to find the yarns that they specifically carry. This kind of stuff, discontinued yarns, happen all the time. We saw this with Hobby Lobby. So let's say that there's not a Joanne or a Michael anywhere near you, and Hobby Lobby is the only place where you can go locally to buy yarn. Now, Hobby Lobby, they had implemented about 2 years ago, maybe, that they're only going to carry their yarn line. So they stopped carrying Lion Brand and stuff. So this kind of thing, it happens all the time. Some yarn brands or yarn lines are tried and true. They have been around forever, forever. Red Heart is a line that's been around forever. Also, Vanna's Choice, Lion Brand Vanna's Choice. The Vanna's Choice has been around for over 30 years. I don't know how long Red Heart has been around, but that has been around as long as I can remember. I've been crocheting for over 25 years. So they've been around forever. Certain things may change, like the colors that are available. And sometimes the branding can change, like the labels and stuff. But for the most part, those certain yarn lines stay tried and true. But some yarn lines are not so lucky. So how do we as crochet designers navigate yarn information in our crochet patterns? And if you've ever worked with me, you already know the answer to this question. It's really simple. We need to give our readers as much information about the yarn as possible. And in this video, I'm going to show you 4 ways that you can write your yarn information so readers can make informed decisions about the yarn that they purchase when they're going to make your pattern. Okay, and something to keep in mind that's really, really important, and I don't think that this is talked about enough, that not everyone who purchases your pattern has access to the yarn that you use. So this isn't just about discontinued yarn. It's about the yarn that's available to your customers. So customers in different countries may not have access to the yarn that you're using in your pattern. People in Australia have access to different yarn brands and yarn lines than we do in America, and vice versa. Same thing with, just any country outside of the US has different yarn brands and yarn lines that are available to them. So if someone from the UK purchased your pattern, they're going to need to know as much information as possible, because they're not going to be able to find the yarn that you used in their country if they want to purchase locally. And sometimes people don't want to purchase yarn online because the shipping is absolutely ridiculous. And then there's also people in the same, that live in the same country that we do, that may not have access. They may not live near a Joanne. They may not be able to afford the yarn that you used. So they're using some yarn that was given to them from their aunt or that they've already had in their stash. So writing yarn information in the ways that I'm going to show you is going to help all your customers, no matter where they live. Now, I always talk about standards when I'm working with my clients editing their patterns. I'm always talking about writing your patterns in a standard form with industry standards. But listing yarn in your pattern, there is not a standard way. I say quote unquote, there's not a standard way to list yarn when writing it in your crochet pattern, but there's some key points that you should consider before you list it. The first thing to consider is yarn brand and yarn name. I cannot express strongly enough how important it is to provide this information. Every customer who purchases your pattern wants to know this information. So listing yarn brand and yarn name. So first and foremost, it's going to help your readers replicate your design. There's some of your customers that purchased your patterns want to know the exact yarn that you use, because they want to go purchase that yarn. If they don't have it in their stash, they want to go purchase that same exact yarn because they want their project to look exactly like how yours looks in the picture. Especially beginners, I think, they don't know how to navigate yarn substitutions. So if they purchase the pattern, they look at the yarn, oh, she's using, big twist plush. So they're going to go buy that specific yarn because they want their project to look exactly like yours. And number 2, it provides clarity and reduces any guesswork for your readers. So when this information is missing from your pattern, your readers kind of have to guess what yarn you're talking about. If you just list, a size, just buy any size 4 yarn, they may not have any idea what you're talking about. Like, okay, what size 4? What does size 4 even mean? You have no idea who's on the other side of your pattern that is reading it. So you have to make sure that you're super, super clear, give as much information as possible. So that way it takes all the guesswork out of choosing the yarn. And then also number 3, readers can look up the detailed specifications of the yarn so that they can make yarn substitutions. So those who know how to navigate that can look up, let's say you use Lion Brand Heartland and you list out the yarn brand and the yarn name. We're going to talk about other things to also list, but you have at least those things. People can look up online all about, and they can read all about Lion Brand Heartland yarn. And then they're like, oh, okay, it's 100% acrylic. It's, size 4 weight. So I have that in my stash. I've got something that can be substituted easily. So, and then also, lastly, it builds trust with your readers. I know you might be thinking, well, how can listing yarn build trust with my readers? If you have, from the very beginning, people see that you have all the information they need before they even get into the written instructions, they have all the materials listed perfectly, nothing is missing, everything's just perfect. That's going to build trust with your readers. They know that they're going to be able to depend on you to give them all the information that they need before they even start working on your pattern. The next thing to consider is yarn weight and yarn fiber. These are also very important things to list. So first and foremost, it's going to help your readers make accurate yarn substitutions. If they know the yarn weight that you used, your readers can find alternatives that match the gauge of the pattern. And we all know that yarn weight affects gauge. They can choose, number 2, they can choose the matching fiber content to achieve the same outcome of the design. And you guys know fiber content affects texture, it affects the stretch of your fabric, it affects the drape, the way that it lays on you. Even with amigurumi, different yarn weights are going to affect the look of your toy. So if your readers know the fiber content, they're going to be able to match that fiber to achieve the same look and the same texture of the design. And then number 3, customers will be able to match yarn when shopping or finding some yarn in their stash. So it is another kind of element to make sure that you cover so that way people will have all the info that they need. And next, yardage and meterage. So should you list, this is a question I get asked all the time. Should I list the yards and meters of the skein or how much I used in my design? And the answer is yes. Mr. Froggy thinks that you need to list both. Now remember, there is not a standard for listing yarn, just like there's not a standard for listing yards and meters in your pattern. If your writing style allows for you to list both the yards and meters of the skein and the yards and meters of how much you used in your design, then do it. But if you were to choose one or the other, I would list yards and meters for the entire skein. So when you list yards and meters for the full skein, that's going to give your customers enough information to make those suitable substitutions. And then, of course, we know skeins of yarn, they vary in yards and meters, even within the same weight category. So if you were to say, you're making an amigurumi pattern, you used up, almost a full skein of yarn for your design. If you were to give them the yards and meters of the full skein, when they go to find the yarn in their stash or in the store, they'll be able to say, oh, okay, there was, this many yards in the one she used, but this one, I want to use this, this skein of yarn, but it only has this much. So I need to make sure I purchase enough. So saying the full skein is going to give them that great information. And if you are going to just list the yards and meters that are just used in your pattern, this is going to prevent customers from wasting money if they have the amount needed, like in their stash, or they, for them to buy just the amount that they need. Some parts of a pattern won't need but a very small bit of yarn. Think, amigurumi facial embroidery. Like you just literally need a string of yarn, right? So when it comes to those types of things where you're just using literally a smidge, you can write down in that section, like after it, you could put into parentheses a 1 yard or whatever. I think that would be feasible. And then also listing how much you use just in your pattern is going to also prevent customers from running out of yarn mid-project. I would say if you are, designing blankets or even scarves, any type of wearable or maybe accessory, this would be a really good way to list yarn in the exact yards and meters that you used for, the size that you used. If you work with a tech editor and you don't know how to adjust how many yards that your readers will need for each size, a tech editor usually can help you figure this out because we've been trained to, calculate those things. So anyway, it's not a have to. You don't have to list the exact yards and meters that were used in your pattern, but I would at least do the full hanks or the full skeins or the full, cakes of yarn. So those are two things to consider strongly. Okay, so 4 ways to list yarn in your crochet pattern. I'm going to share with you the 4 ways, and then I'm going to share with you 2 of them that are my favorite that I recommend highly. Okay, so the first one is yarn weight. You list the yarn weight, the percentage of fiber. If there's 2 different fiber contents, list percentage for, one fiber and the percentage for the next fiber. And then how many yards and meters per gram of skein, and then list the color name, and then how many skeins you used. So I used, as an example, the Vanna's Choice. So Vanna's Choice is a medium worsted weight size 4 yarn. Make sure that you write that it's a medium, that it's worsted weight, and that it's a size 4. Doing this, giving them all this information here, like leaves there's no ambiguity at all here. And then of course it's 100% acrylic. If it was like, let's say 50% acrylic, 50% cotton, then you would put that 50% acrylic, 50% cotton. And then there's 170 yards per, or 170 yards and 156 meters per 100 gram skein, and the color is brick. Now, if the brand that you're using have a number skew with the color, it's really good to add that information as well. It's not really necessary, but if that's how it's listed on their website or wherever you purchase it, if it's on the back of the yarn label, brick 860133J, then I would highly encourage you to also list it in your pattern, just so that way there's no mistaking anything. And then of course you put how many skeins. And then the next way to list yarn is X yards of yarn company, list the yarn name, the percentage of the fiber, X amount of yards per X gram. And then you write the total balls used in parentheses with the color name. So here, of course, I'm again using Lion Brand Vanna's Choice, 255 yards of Lion Brand Vanna's Choice, 100% acrylic, 170 yards per 100 gram. And this design, I used 1.5 skeins in brick. So this is great to use if you want to list how many yards were used in your design. So if you have different sizes, let's say for a garment, you have different sizes that you have listed in your pattern, then you're going to have to list all how much yards per size. So that's something really to consider as well. You can list it out in like bullet points, small, this many yards, medium, this many yards, large, extra large, and so forth and so on. Or if you're doing a blanket in like 3 different sizes, like crib, throw, and full size, you can list the yards like that, for each one. And then the next one is yarn company, yarn name, the yarn weight, percentage of fiber, X yards, X meters per X gram skein, and then the color name, and then X amount of skeins that you used. So again, I'm using Vanna's Choice for my design. So this is how it would look. I would say Lion Brand, Vanna's Choice, size 4, 100% acrylic, 170 yards, and 156 meters per 100 gram skein, color brick. And I used 2 skeins for my design. And then last but not least, we have X size, X weight with a gauge of X stitches and X rows with the size X, and then in parentheses, the millimeter crochet hook. So this is how it would look. Again, using Vanna's Choice. It would be size 4, worsted weight with a gauge of 12 single crochets and 15 rows with the size J10 6 millimeter crochet hook. I'm just going to let you know right off the bat, this one is not my favorite way to list yarn, because what it does is it gives the gauge information of the yarn, what's recommended by the Craft Yarn Council, and not what you used. And I think that your customers might focus more on this gauge instead of the gauge in your pattern. So I'll tell you right off the bat, this is not my favorite way. I never recommend this way. I didn't even want to put this way in my slide, but I did because I wanted to give you all the information. So I'm just going to X this one out. Don't use this one. I don't recommend it. Okay, so I do have 2 favorite ways to list yarn, and they are to use either the yarn company with the yarn name and the yarn weight with the percent fiber, X yards, X meters per X grams of skein, color name, and then how many skeins. This is the one that I recommend the most because it just gives tons of information. And I work with a lot of designers who design smaller accessories or amigurumi patterns. And this is the perfect way because it gives your readers all the information that they need. And then the second way is X yards of, yarn company and yarn name, percentage fiber, X yards per X gram total skeins used or total balls used, and then the color name. Okay, now let's get into what you are dying to know. Should you update yarn info in previously published patterns if it's not written like how I already showed you? Here's my advice. If you've worked with the tech editor already, chances are your yarn information does not need to be updated. If you've worked with the tech editor, I am almost guaranteed that your tech editor has either provided you the type of information that you needed to list your yarn, or you've kind of already figured out your style of listing your yarn. So first and foremost, I would just say start with your next pattern. If you have not worked with a tech editor and you're like, oh no, I need to go back and change everything, pause for a minute, what you're going to do is you're going to start with your next pattern. Decide which method you liked, which way that I showed you. Pick one and then list your yarn information from your next pattern forward consistently the same way using that, that method. But make sure that you format it the same every single time, because consistency is key when writing crochet patterns. Next is, if you're wanting to go back and update previously published patterns, I would not recommend going in and making small changes, because it's going to require reformatting. You're going to have to re-export files. You're going to have to notify customers. There's going to be version updates, which I will probably talk about this maybe in a later podcast about version updates, because when you make updates to your patterns, there's versions that you have to put, that you have to write. And then, of course, if there's errors, then there's the errata that you need to, document, and it's a whole mess. So it's best not to make small changes. So the only time that you should go in and make small updates is if your pattern has already been tech edited, and maybe a customer found an error in your pattern, or maybe that you're just updating a small section for clarity purposes. Then you work with your tech editor and say, hey, this is what happened, or this is what's going on. And they normally will just real quick be like, oh yeah, I see that there's an error that maybe I didn't find or whatever. And they'll help you word it or, clarify those sections. Then you can go in and make that small change. That's the only time that I would go in and make small updates. And if you're wanting to go back and update a pattern, I would be strategic. Go to your most popular pattern and start there and update the entire pattern. Work with a tech editor to, get it completely formatted perfectly, make sure that there's no errors, just go through the whole gamut, get it tech edited, get it tested again, and then you can come out with a 2.0 of your pattern. It's a great marketing strategy. So I would not go in and make those small updates. Just work with a tech editor doing an entire pattern update. And if you're wanting to, update a pattern, or if you're needing a pattern to be tech edited, I have availability. I'm currently open for new clients, and all my contact information is going to be in the description box below. I hope that today's video was helpful. I hope I didn't overwhelm your brain with information. Luckily, this is a video, so you can keep going back and listening and seeing the different ways that the yarn is listed that I recommend. And of course, if you ever have any questions, you can always email me, shoot me a message, and I will do my best to answer your questions. And if you have a pattern that needs editing, I am available. You can contact me in the description box below. But anyway, y'all, we will find out in the next couple of weeks if Joanne's going to go out of business. Here's to you, Joanne. We're hoping that you don't, but if you do, we're going to go buy all that cheap yarn. Y'all know we're all going to stock up.